Rain came like a verdict that evening, sharp, thorough, relentless, and Mara Blackwell learned how small a single sheet of paper could make a person feel. The tavern's lamp quivered as if frightened by its own light. Lantern smoke braided with the rain's sigh. Mara sat alone at the end of the counter, palms reddened from kneading dough, the inn's ledger heavy at her elbow like an unspoken ledger of debts she could not pay. She had the letter open on her lap, the brokering house's seal, an embossed bird with crooked talons, staring up at her as if accusing her of some private failure. Too fat to be suitable. The words were clean and indifferent, inked with the economy of a clerk who had never stood behind a stove, who had never lifted a child's fevered forehead or sewn a widow's sleeve. Too fat. Mara read it twice, then 3 times, and the phrase became a small stone she held to her chest. She pressed the paper there, because it seemed the filmy thing might repel the ache, might keep the warm, bunched shape of herself from spilling out. She thought of her mother's hands, calloused, forgiving, and of all the nights she had sat up by the embers while strangers slept and snored and trusted her with their secrets. What had any of it been worth if a ledger could say she did not measure properly? Outside, the rain learned the language of grief. It hammered the inn's wooden bones, went searching in the gaps, found the soft places. The shutters rattled, making a thin music. Mara folded the letter with fingers that did not seem entirely hers and slid it beneath the loose plank in the lower floor, where she kept a single rusted needle and a scrap of her mother's shawl. It should have been a transaction, name, measurement, a dry note, yet it landed in her chest like a broken promise. She pressed her forehead against the rough grain of the counter and tried to remember how to breathe past the smallness of the accusation. Sleep, when it arrived, was a shallow thing, half remembered as if it were the dream of a stranger. In that dark, a voice came, a sound like silver pennies knocked together, calling her. It did not shout, it did not cajole. It merely said her name with an intimacy that felt like danger. She woke with the scent of lilies in her nose and a cold that had nothing to do with the drafty inn. Her pillow felt damp from a fever she did not have. She told herself that dreams were the mind's mischief, that they meant nothing. And yet she found her hand returning to the spot where the letter lay hidden, as if the paper could anchor the fluttering that had begun inside her. Word of the broker's caravan reached the village like the first notes of an ugly song, heard in doorways, repeated in market squares, exaggerated in the telling. A man in a patched cloak had come down the road, and with him a flurry of promises. Matchings for distant lords, alliances sealed with dowries, livelihoods rearranged with an inked flourish. The town's women folded their hands and measured their faces in the market mirror. The men sharpened opinions with the ease of those who live by the cutting of an axe. Mara tried to keep out of the gossip, because gossip has teeth and knew how to bite the soft places. She swept the floor, she sorted linens, she pretended not to watch the square. Still, curiosity is a small animal that will never be fully tamed. It peered from the corners of her eyes with an intensity that burned like a coal. The broker set up his canvas tent at the crossroads, a small kingdom of flannel and lantern smoke. He had a voice that could make anything commodity sweet and a smile that refused to meet anyone's eyes for too long. He read faces as one reads pages and gave the village a ledger in return. Names, prices, measurements. He took to pacing like a satisfied animal, and people lined up as if to choose clothes. Mara stood by the inn's door as the caravan's horses stamped mud and steam into the night. She watched the way the broker scribbled and barked and sorted. It should have meant nothing to her. She had always known smallness, and this trade in brides was an arrangement designed by men who believed size could be measured and worth assigned. When the cloaked nobleman first appeared, the air shifted the way the tide shifts before a storm. He had the quiet of someone who belonged to rooms with high ceilings and to midnight windows. His cloak was plain, but cut in a way that suggested more than coin, years of manner, and a lineage that had been taught nothing but the silence of good breeding. He did not step into the light, but stood at the tent's edge like a shadow testing the boundaries. The moon found him then and drew a silver thin across his jaw. He watched Mara with the same attention one might give a painting, not rubbing against it, not demanding explanation, simply seeing. There was something in his eyes when the moon skimmed them, an inner brightness that did not belong to a human night. Mara, wrapped in a wet shawl and spleen soured from the letter she had hidden, felt the sensation run along her spine like cold water. She could have turned away. She could have told herself the old rules: never meet a noble's glance, never encourage notice. But the caravan had the smell of iron and ink and old promises, and this man moved as if he had stepped out of the edges of a story someone whispered to scare children. The broker noticed him and immediately moved like a cat toward a fresh mouse. He introduced the nobleman with a flourish, and the man's voice was as soft as dusk. "We are matching suitable brides for distant houses," the broker said, the word suitable like a small hammer. "We have options." He gestured as if he were rearranging the populace like chess pieces. A murmur ran through the crowd. Faces turned, speculations made their nest. Men who would never leave the valley contemplated the horizon as if it might answer their little questions. Women smoothed their skirts and pretended not to hope, because to hope in plain view is invitation for ridicule. Mara felt her throat tighten. The world had reduced her to measurements before. It now offered her a choice and called it mercy. The nobleman asked the broker for one thing with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Show me the rejected list." The broker smiled with a professional's pity. There was a long pause, a rustling of papers, the quiet of shifting fate. The villagers exchanged looks. To be rejected is a kind of exile, a small death without the ceremony. To be asked to show the rejected is to rip that wound open and let everyone peer at the scar tissue. Myra felt the sharpness of those gazes like a line drawn along her ribs. She wanted to walk away, to put distance between herself and the way people measured and decided. Instead, she found herself moving forward because something in her, some stubborn, half-undressed thing, wished to be witnessed. She was called without ceremony a day later, summoned to the tent by the broker who had spoken many times of markets and measures. His lantern threw a small circle of light. The rest of the tent folded into dark cloth and the scent of horses. The nobleman sat waiting inside, his hands that were pale as bone folded like a study in patience. The broker took Mara's measure like someone taking stock. The tilt of shoulders, the set of jaw, the way she held a cup, then the manner in which her fingers brushed her hair. He spoke in words that were both business and a trap. "Tell us where you work, child. Tell us what you can do." Mara told them because there are things in the world that must be said aloud to make them true. She spoke of baking at dawn and mending in the evening, of keeping the inn when storms closed the road, and of the way she watched for strangers who might need shelter. She told them of the fevered child whose small hand she had held, and of the widow whose laugh she had coaxed back into a stiff mouth. When she spoke of her mother, long gone, her voice wavered, and the nobleman's eyes softened and became something less like a mirror than a window. He asked about small things, and in the asking she felt the world widen. "Do you dream?" he asked. "Of what do you dream when the rain speaks through the eaves?" She laughed then, small and surprised. "Dreams are for the young and for fools," she said, because fear makes people joke. But the nobleman was not satisfied with that dismissal. He leaned forward, and the moon picked out a line of silver just under his lashes. "Name one thing you would not trade for warmth," he said. "Name one truth you would hold when others bargain away their souls." Mara had expected brusque questions, dowries, years of youth, a slate of physical attributes. Instead, his questions brushed at the private places in her like a wind looking for a seam. She told him, without meaning to, about the way she loved the inn and the people who passed through it, about the stubbornness that had kept the place from folding into ruins, about the odd, sad things she hoarded. An old child's wooden horse, a scarf with a moth hole, the letters her mother once wrote, and which she had never learned to read properly. "I wouldn't trade the way the kettle sings in the morning," she said finally, and the tent grew very still. He smiled then, a small, startling thing that made the shadows around him look alive. "You are not what I expected," he said. The broker's hand hovered above his ledger, fingers itching at ink as if to correct a line. "And yet you are exactly what I need." Mara felt the room tilt like a pitcher tipping over. "You need me." Her voice was a question and a plea at once. The nobleman stood. His movement was slow and precise, like someone accustomed to doors opening at the sound of a foot on a stair. He stepped into the light, and for the first time Mara saw him properly. Tall, pale, the kind of pallor that made his eyes into moons within their sockets. He was not merely a noble. He seemed an artifact of refined grief. "I am looking for someone who remembers what warmth means," he said. "Someone whose measure cannot be taken from a ledger. Will you come north?" The broker preened and made notes, as if he were sealing a deal no ordinary market could appraise. Mara felt the old terror, the fear of being treated like a commodity, rise like bile. "I am not a lord's toy," she said, "because there are things one must declare before they take a vow that will never be asked for in return." "You will not be a toy," the nobleman said, and the timbre of his voice carried something that felt absurdly like promise. "You will be more dangerous." Fear and a stranger unnameable tugged at her at once. To go meant to leave the small known world, the inn's crooked hearth, the scolding of neighbors, the ledger with its neat condemnations. To stay meant folding into the shape everyone expected, a life measured and small. Mara thought of the letter in her floorboard, of the clerk's neat cruelty, and then of the voice that had called her name in the dream. She thought of warmth, of the kettle, of all the small true things she loved. She took one breath and then another and said, not with the bravado of a heroine in a song, but with the weary logic of a woman who had kept too many lives from unraveling, "Yes." The nobleman inclined his head, the cloth of his cloak whispering like a secret. Outside, the rain began to ease as if it had been waiting to witness the decision. Mara packed the smallest necessities she owned: a woolen dress, the needle from beneath the floorboard, her mother's scarf. She had not told anyone yet, because some choices are soft things that must be wrapped and kept until they can stand in the light. She looked once at the inn's low window where the tavern's patrons slept, where the embers cooled. Then, with the broker's hand deft as a thief, and the nobleman's gaze like an oath she did not understand, she stepped into a road that went north, toward a castle she had only ever imagined like a nightmare folded into marble. As she left, the nobleman's eyes found hers, and held them with a gravity that felt like a promise and a warning. The moon caught his profile, and for a fractured instant, Mara thought she saw something under his skin, a vibration of old winters, a hunger so ancient it had learned the shape of time. She pressed her lips together, a small brace against the world's bending, and let the necessary fear twist itself into a strange, undeniable curiosity. The road to Nightfin was a throat of fog and stone, a place where the world narrowed until only the sound of the cart's wheels and the wind remained. Snow began as a rumor, flakes like tiny ash, then a steady, deliberate falling that powder-coated the boot-prints and smothered the hedgerows. Trees leaned inward as if to listen. The black pines stood like sentinels stitched against the gray. Wolves called to the white, and the call traveled like a rumor of hunger, answering itself in intervals that made Mara want to press the carriage door shut and never look out. The nobleman who had come for her, Lucien, as she would learn his name to be, sat opposite, his cloak a shadow that did not seem to chill him. He kept his gaze on the road, on the angles of landscape that might mean something only to someone who had been taught to read lines of terrain the way others read books. When at last she dared to speak, it was to the sound of her own voice seeming too bright in the somber carriage. "Is it always like this, the North?" she asked. Her fingers had found the wool of her scarf and twisted it between two nails until the skin whitened. "It is always what it needs to be," he said, the answer both an avoidance and a kind of fact. His voice had the quiet of rooms where no unnecessary noise is permitted. "The land remembers. It remembers what has been done to it and the kinds of ones who pass through." Mara watched his profile. He was younger than the portraits she had once seen in the market, less a face of legend than one of precise sorrow. There was something in the set of his mouth that suggested long practice at holding pain private. When she tried to imagine him smiling, she felt as if she were trying to remember a tune she had only heard in a dream. When the first sight of Nightfin arrived, it was not so much seen as felt. The castle crouched on a cliff like an animal that had grown out of the rock itself, its towers twisted as if shaped by hands that loved ruins more than newness. Between its ribs flowed a black river, glass-slick and unmoving, which reflected the turrets in long, dishonest strips. Bats took the air in ragged, deliberate arcs. The sky was a slab of iron. The carriage stopped and the horses stamped, blowing steam into the chill like little ghosts. Mara stepped off and felt all the air around her become a thing pressed close and heavy. Servants met them at the threshold, not with cheer, but with the kind of mechanical obedience that comes of long practice around a power that does not sleep. Their eyes flicked away from the daylight, as if they had rehearsed 1,000 ways not to see, and their skin carried the pallor of someone who avoids noon. Mirrors were wrapped and stored away in cloth, windows shaded with heavy curtains. Small dishes of salt and iron lay at certain doorways, as if ritual defense could be kept in chipped pottery. Their hands trembled slightly, not with cold, but with the weight of 1,000 small prohibitions. Mara, who had lived with the honest filth of inn life and the warmth of open windows, found the atmosphere both graceful and suffocating. A woman with hollowed cheeks and a braid of silver thread took Mara's cloak and folded it with more ceremony than she had ever seen for a simple guest. "We do not leave the East Gallery windows open in winter," she murmured by way of instruction. "Do not wear bright colors in the hall." There were rules everywhere, invisible as cobwebs, and they clung to Mara the way a shawl might stick to damp skin. When Lucien first stepped into the great hall to formally present Mara, the room seemed to sigh. He moved with a will that never seemed hurried. His steps were like chords in a slow song. The nobles gathered were not the brass-sung regulars of a merchant court. They wore pale, aristocratic skin and spoke little. Their attire was sumptuous and severe at once. Velvets the color of night, collars cut like crescents, jewelry that remembered moonlight more than sun. Their faces turned to her as if to appraise a painting. The way her hair sat, the curve of her cheek, the warmth she carried, an elemental thing that seemed transgressive against the careful composure of their features. He addressed the court, and then her with a voice that folded itself into the rafters. "This is Mara Blackwell," he said, and when he said her name, she felt it like a bell rung within the center of her chest. "She has stepped beyond a road she did not choose to walk. Let us receive her with the consideration our guests deserve." A murmur of judgment rose like a tide. Some among the nobles angled their heads and made the quiet sounds of those who measure things by the rules of a ledger. One of them, a lord with shoulders like iron and a chin scar that argued for a different kind of violence, allowed his lips to thin into what Mara recognized even then as contempt. The banquet was arranged as if to reaffirm dominion. Tables long as ships, candelabras that dripped wax like waxen tears, dishes whose steam made mirrors fog, but the mirrors were wrapped away so that no one might see the true reflection of what they ate. Music sighed like a morning wind in the background, strings, low and persistent, a stone's sound. Mara sat at the end of a table on a bench too narrow for comfort and felt the nobility's eyes pass over her as if she were part of the meal. They watched her body more than they watched her hands. They noted the traces of honest labor, calluses, a slightly rounded belly that had been more useful than beautiful in the making of dough, and they catalogued her warmth as if it were a fault. It felt like being measured in public. The experience had the antiseptic cruelty of a market exchange. She kept her hands crossed in her lap, felt the hem of her dress under her fingers, and tried to speak lightly of the food and the journey. When a nobleman near her tusked at the portion of bread she allowed herself, the laughter that followed felt like a small storm. Lucien's defense of her was not a flourish, but a simple, devastating affirmation. He stood then, and the hall quieted as if waiting for him to recite something ancient and precise. "You catalogue warmth as a liability," he said, voice carrying, and there was an odd, half-amused pity in it. "You speak of vigor as if it were a defect." He looked at those nearest him with a hardness that suggested old grievances. Then he turned to Mara, and his expression changed as if a private flame had been struck. "She is the only one among you still alive," he said, and in that sentence the room rebalanced. They received his words with a variety of small responses, a thin, indrawn breath, a curl of mirth, a sharp whisper. Mara felt the sentence land in her like a small, warming stone, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to believe it. Believe that her warmth was not a mark of shame, but a kind of armor. Even when the nobles resumed their measured chatter, she had noticed that the iron-faced lord had not presented a meal with as steady a hand. That Isolde, Lucien's sister, had watched him with a look that was not entirely hostile and not entirely approving. Behind the curtained corners of the hall, things whispered of other rules. Brother Havel, who kept to candlelight and parchment, had a voice like one who has read many marginalia. He sought Mara out with a softness that was more curiosity than condescension. "There are stories about those who come from southern hands," he told her later, when the hall was emptied of the bulk of nobles, and the moon had risen to mingle its cold with the candles. "Stories in which blood remembers a son. Not all of them are kind." His eyes, rimmed by sleeplessness and scholarship, studied her as if comparing her features to a half-remembered diagram. Isolde found Mara in a corridor lined with tapestries the color of dried roses. She was dressed not like the others, but in shades that suggested mourning for a person who had only ever been alive in rumor. Her voice had the crispness of distant thunder. "He will either crown you or consume you," she said softly, and in that sentence was the careful measure of someone who had been close enough to the king to see the fault lines. There was both warning and a peculiar, almost reluctant sympathy in her tone. "He keeps people close until their breath makes him remember how to count. Then he learns why he feared the numbers." Mara felt the sentence like a weather report. It was factual, and it was an omen. The castle lived on the warm edge between hospitality and entrapment, and she could feel the two halves tugging at her. That night she found sleep was thinner and dreams more insistent. Silver eyes, the touch of fingers that did not cool, and the echo of Brother Havel's phrase. Blood remembers a son turning in her mind like an unfamiliar spoon in a well. The garden, when she found it, had been designed by someone who loved beauty by way of sorrow. It was a clipped, moonlit place once intended for private promenades. Winding paths of flagstone, statues that stared with the dignity of things that never speak, and beds where roses had once been curated into seasons of blush. Now the roses hung their heads like old courtiers, their petals browned at the edges and shorn of scent. The fountain at the garden's heart had a thin crust of ice that did not quite reflect the sky. Vines had begun to claim the stone, writing script in green that suggested histories left to rot. Lucien found her among the ruins of the roses. He had taken to seeking out places where shadow met the thin, honest light of moon. He approached as someone who had practiced the manners of surprise, soft steps, no fanfare. When he spoke, his voice folded into the garden's low rustle. "You tend to the small things," he said. "You examine what other people throw away." There was no question in it, only observation. Mara answered him with the modest pride one keeps for honest labor. "Someone must," she said. "The roses don't bloom without water, and the fountain doesn't sing without attention." He nodded, and for a moment they stood in mutual recognition, two people whose hands had learned certain economies of care. He spoke to her then of things the court would not discuss. The nights when hunger made even the courtiers pale with reckoning, the way the castle's portraits seemed to watch with an interest sharper than loyalty. "There are things that life takes and things it gives back in different currency," he murmured, and when he said it there was a tremor beneath his words, an admission disguised as fact. She listened, and in listening felt a curdling of pity and dread at once. "I do not know how to be in rooms where people measure me," she confessed, the candor awash after so many polite deceptions. "I know how to be in kitchens, at fires, with steam in my face." His expression briefed itself into something older than gentleness. He reached out, and the tip of his finger brushed the cool bloom of a rose. "I have learned how to inhabit rooms where people are made into inventories," he said. The look he gave her was like a raw piece of truth offered with hands that had been both kind and roughened. "It is a dangerous art." The air between them grew intimate in the way words did when there was a current pulling them close. Not physical intimacy first, but something that felt like the tightening of a cord. He spoke less of himself than of the shapes left in his wake. A chorus of lovers who could not stay, a court that had learned to survive on distant things, and a name that echoed more than it was remembered. She listened and realized that for all his distance, there was a human thing beneath the chill. An ache that could perhaps be soothed by the warmth she carried without meaning to. They leaned toward each other as if toward a promise, and the world held its breath for them. The tension tightened, an almost kiss hovered like a pendulum between them, when the sky changed. The moon reddened at the edges, as if someone had spilled wine across silver, and an eclipse began its slow work. Shadows lengthened, and the features of the garden sharpened into a clarity that made every petal look like an accusation or a confession. Lucien's hand hesitated and withdrew, and Mara felt the sensation of being both wanted and watched. The complicity of a near touch and the ancient warning that sometimes the things one desires pull at things one cannot control. When the blood moon rose full, the garden's mood curdled into something fraught. It was as if the world itself were dividing into portions, one that remained for ordinary living and one that belonged to hunger. Mara stepped back, not out of prudence but from a fear that had nothing to do with propriety. Lucien watched her, his face a study in restraint. "There are knights," he said quietly, "that remember older bargains than I do." He looked not at the garden but at a space inside it where shadows seemed to have collected like spilled ink. "Know this, I fear what I might take if I forget myself." In the days after, the castle felt like a heartbeat learning a new rhythm. Brother Havel found Mara with stacks of brittle pages that smelled of dust and old ink. He read to her from a script that made the hairs at her nape stand up. Stories of an old line called the Sunborn, people whose blood had once been sung as a remedy for cold hearts. His fingers tapped the margins where scribes had once annotated prophecy like careful, terrified neighbors. They believed warmth could be a weapon, he told her. They wrote that if you bound a night-born heart to a sun-born blood, the night might either become gentled or burn fiercely. The script is cautious. The scribes were frightened. Mara swallowed. The notion of her heritage, something she had suspected in the dim corners of childhood but had never seen in parchment, was now made heavy and particular. She carried the small, private knowledge from the inn like a fossil. Her mother's hair, the lullabies hummed in a voice cracked by sorrow, a set of small superstitions that had become part of her bone. Brother Havel's words placed those fragments on a table between them and turned them to evidence. Court murmurs shifted into something closer to a tide. Some of the nobles, sensing a risk to their centuries-old equilibrium, began to scheme. If Mara's blood could restore Lucien to anything like warmth, they imagined a power that could upend their comfortable predations. If he were human in the way he had been when the world still owned a son, would he decide to live differently? Would he grow tender in ways that made them vulnerable? Fear breeds action, and action breeds betrayal. Mara soon found she was not prepared for treachery of a very small and very personal kind. One night, as she poured broth for the kitchens, her hands moving by muscle memory, the heat of familiar comfort, a serving woman with a face like a map of old grief pressed something into her palm. A coin with the broker's seal. "From a friend," the woman whispered, her eyes as slippery as eels. "Keep safe. They will pay better for compliance." Mara stared at the coin and felt the sudden, awful literacy of her life as if someone had traced a finger over a map to show her where the land yielded to cliff. She knew, in the way a cook knows when a stew is oversalted, that this was not charity. She had not been naive about the machinations of power. Still, to be the object of a small, personal conspiracy was its own form of loneliness. She confronted the woman and found her expression a portrait of survival, pale, resigned, ashamed. Word of the plot reached Lucien in the way secrets often do at court. Through the scent, the tilt of conversation, the small fissures opened in ledgers. He moved with an almost animal speed. Mara did not feel the scrape of claws she expected. Instead, she felt the rush of a hand, the strength of it, the care. He intercepted her in a passage, his eyes darker than the night and alive with a thing that was not sorrow but something edged with threat. Before she understood it, the serving woman's plot had been stopped. The coin was gone, and Lucien, hands around her shoulders, had been transformed by a display she would later remember as both monstrous and tender. Under moonlight, and with a violence that was born more of desperation than malice, Lucien revealed himself in ways the court had censored from children's tasks. Not merely the polite aspects of pale skin and melancholy, but the undercurrent. Teeth tipped like the points of old knives, veins dark with a map of illness. And not wings in the way a cloth makes wings, but great, membranous expanses folded at his back like a creature's hidden geometry. He moved with a ferocity that stripped away etiquette like paper. When he pressed his mouth to the vein at his own wrist, drawing as if to remind himself of a particular pain, Mara felt both horror and something that resembled pity for a man so near to his own ruin. He did not bite her. He did not drink. He cradled her, the way someone might hold a fragile bird that has been plucked from a storm. "You must never mistake me for simple hunger," he whispered, and she could feel his breath cool on her ear. "There are bargains older than bone that shape what I must do. I will not let them have you as collateral." Fear, pity, and an odd protectiveness braided themselves in Mara then, forming knots she had never intended to tie. She watched him as he retreated into his courtly shadow and realized that what she felt for him was no neat thing. It was not only revulsion or horror. It was not only sympathy. It was, disturbingly, the slow burn of compassion for a being who had been softened by centuries of solitude, and who, in his moments of losing control, became something dangerous indeed. She wondered if she could be the warmth the scripts had suggested, or whether she was simply naive, a small, bright thing in a castle that ate light. The truth, as Brother Havel and Isolde both suggested in their separate, careful ways, lay tangled in history and in choices yet to be made. The court had begun to count the cost. Mara had only just begun to learn the shape of currency that mattered. The court's anger was a slow, deliberate thing that gathered like stormwater behind a dam. It began in glances sharpened into whispers and turned to open fury when the ledger, always the ledger, was consulted, and the math no longer satisfied the noble's need for certainty. To them, Mara was an anomaly, a woman who carried sunlight in her veins and threatened the comfortable calculus of eternal appetite. She had stepped into a world that measured life as a resource, and the notion that warmth could be weaponized was intolerable. Those who had long feasted in the half-light found themselves counting losses in the face of a possibility no one had bothered to reckon with before. A king returned to the mortal rhythm of a beating heart would upset the hierarchy that allowed them to take as they pleased. It began with small affronts. A tray left too late at a lord's supper. A whispered word about her origins in the tapestry rooms. Then, one evening as frost rimed the windows like lace, a formal motion was moved in the great hall. Mara's presence, they declared, was an unacceptable vector of change. For the first time since memories were counted, the nobles voted against a decision the king had made. The vote was a quiet, terrible thing, a folding of hands and a stamping down of dissent. Their faces were composed, but they had the tenseness of predators aware of a shifting wind. Isolde watched the proceedings from an embroidered chair, hands wrapped around a cup as if to feel something steady in the heat of terror. Her loyalty to the king was a fractured thing. She loved him in part because she had once loved better days, and in part because she had no other proper claim to softness. In the hush, she rose, not with the theatricality of a defender delivering a speech, but with the economy of someone who had learned to choose her battles. She spoke in a voice that barely allowed emotion to unfasten itself. "This council seeks security at the cost of cruelty," she said. "If we dilute the very thing that keeps us human, if we extinguish any chance at better judgment, what remains of us will be less than we pretend." Her words slid through the room like a small blade. There was no applause. There was, however, a new kind of reckoning, a fracture between those who measured immortality as right and those who remembered the possibility of different lives. Isolde, in her caution, offered clandestine support to Mara. She ferried notes and provided safe times when Mara might walk the lesser corridors unseen. In the dark hours, she whispered that loyalty could mean choosing the lesser bearing of shame. Lucien felt the vote like a physical pressure on his chest. He had been trained to dictate, to have decisions upheld, to be obeyed with a dutiful grace that kept a dynasty lubricated. Here, in his own hall, his will had been measured and found wanting. He had never imagined the nobility would count themselves more important than his desire to choose. He had never imagined, perhaps, because he had long ago stopped allowing himself the luxury, that he might have to decide between the governance of his realm and the keepsake of a fragile human heart. To protect her from the growing violence, he arranged for Mara to be sequestered in the East Tower, a room with thick walls, narrow windows, and tapestries that muttered of ancestry. It was a place meant for preservation and not for living. Guards changed at stipulated intervals, servants brought meals wrapped in cloth and eyes that would not linger. The room was safe in the way a cage might be. They told her it was temporary, a matter of prudence while the court regained its composure. What they did not tell her was that the decision had been, in part, a confession. He could not trust his court not to hurt her, and he could not trust himself not to be the cause of that hurt. Locked away, Mara's small kitchen knowledges became dangerous luxuries. She paced the small space, hands spread along the stone as if trying to understand cold by touching it. The solitude stung. It had the citrus acidity of a wound touched again and again. She thought of Isolde's thin, steady voice and of Brother Havel's parchment eyes, of the baker's boy who had once given her a crust of bread with the kind of question that betrays hunger. The walls echoed. She heard in the seam of the mortar the same old measurement. This is what you are worth. At last, driven by equal parts anger and fear, she requested an audience. Lucien led her into a hall that smelled of iron and dust. He did not stride with the assuredness of a sovereign keen on rebuke. Instead, he waited like a man at the edge of something he could not fully name. She met him with the bluntness of someone who had always had to speak plainly to be heard. "You lock me away as if I am the dangerous thing," she said. "All the while, your court sits and pretends its conscience is not bought with other people's blood." He listened without interruption, and there was a light in his eyes that made her think of the way moonlight sometimes found a gold coin in the gutter. She continued, words sharpened, fingers uncurling as if the gesture would release a tether. "You keep people like me as a curiosity, an experiment in your own ability to remain humane," she said. "Do you think that makes you heroic? It makes you cautious. It makes you cowardly." For a moment his face was stone. Then, like the breaking of a wave against immovable rock, his composure fractured into something painfully human. He stepped closer, and the sound of his breath seemed disproportionate to the mannered airs he wore in public. "Call it whatever you will," he said, voice rougher than the tone he used at court. "You took something from me by reminding me what warmth feels like. I have been practicing solitude for centuries, and in that practice I learned to keep others at bay." "You could have trusted them to be better," she snapped, but her voice softened. "You could have trusted yourself." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again there was a rawness behind the pale irises no one at court had ever seen. "I chose you," he said, and the admission was like a thing of glass, clear, fragile, dangerous. "I chose you because you reminded me what warmth feels like." The sentence settled between them like an accord. It was not the swagger of a king making a proclamation. It was a confession of a need. Mara felt a tangle of things: vindication, sorrow, terror, compassion. She folded up her hands inside one another as if to keep from reaching toward him and then drawing back. "You are afraid," she said finally, "of being wrong, of being exposed, of losing what you've had to steal to survive." "So are you," he replied, "of being taken from, of being erased." They stood in the hush after that, two people whose histories read like old battles, whose present was a fragile negotiation. The court's rebellion did not abate. If anything, it hardened. Plotting continued in the shadows, and the nobles' resolve sharpened into a plan that would unmake the comfort of the king's indecision. The rebellion escalated on a night when the sky was a hard black sheet, and the wind had learned to speak malevolent things. The nobles, led by the iron-shouldered lord and a cabal of those most invested in the established order, stormed the inner court. They demanded an end to what they called a dangerous experiment. They demanded control. The hall filled with a fevered noise, metal clattered, torches flamed, and the music that had once been background laments now felt like a dirge. Voices rose to a level that had not been heard since the court had to defend itself against invaders. The attack was a ritual in its own right, a reassertion of power that assumed the right to decide who would live and who would be sacrificed. Isolde, whose alliances had long been more complex than anyone allowed themselves to admit, moved like a shadow through the melee. She had given silent instruction to certain guards and made covert passageways available. In the chaos, she reached Mara's chamber not as a savior, but as an accomplice in a desperate scheme to move the crisis onto a field that mattered less than the survival of both Mara and something larger: the possibility of change. The rebellion's violence spilled like spilled ink through the halls. Blood was not the theatrical, romanticized crimson of candlelight. It was the honest, terrible color of injury and error. The castle itself seemed to shudder with grief, its old stones creaking as if bowing to a fate they had long foreseen. Mara, roused from her enforced seclusion, found herself thrust into a moment where clear decisions had to be made at the speed of survival. Brother Havel, who had retreated from the assembly to clutch scrolls and notes, came to her side as if scripture could be a shield, his face pale but set. There was a council among those who opposed the spirit of the court that the only end to the threat Mara represented was removal, permanent removal. They would not attempt to negotiate because to negotiate would be to acknowledge that the old order might bend. Instead, they chose force. They planned to take her to the high parapets and cast her to the mercies below, a symbolic death that would reassure them of their dominion. The plan was barbaric in its simplicity and confident in its cruelty. Word of the plan reached Lucien in the way fear often speaks to those who have the means to listen. In the tremor of a guard's step, in the clipped orders of men who were once loyal but whose hunger had learned to justify any means. He moved like a man who had been given a knife and found himself unsure of the right edge to take. The castle was at war in pockets. Corridors were battlegrounds stitched with the blood of old servitors who had trusted too long. When he discovered the plot to murder her, something in him snapped like winter ice. He arrived at the parapet not with a retinue, but with a silence that made even the most battle-hardened guards look small. The rebels were there, poised for their drama, their faces lifted like those who expect the sky to nod in approval at cruelty. Lucien stepped between them and Mara with a recklessness that defied reason. He did not speak at once. Instead, he moved as if to remove his cloak, and in that small action, the geometry of his body revealed the otherness he had tried to keep tender and hidden. The violence he showed then was raw and swift. He fought not like a nobleman engaged in sparring, but with the feral grace of a thing that remembered hunger and had learned to turn it into defense. The rebels underestimated him. They had catalogued his restraint and thought restraint meant frailty. He proved them wrong. He struck in a frenzy, not merely to win the fight, but to protect and to punish the idea that his decisions could be overridden by Ledger's smallness. In the afterlight, men lay groaning, some grievously wounded, some not moving at all. It was in the immediate quiet that followed this small, terrible battle that Brother Havel found Mara, hands stained, eyes wide with an understanding that war often brings. "There is a way," he said, voice raw with urgency. He had finally, in the midst of the rebellion, pieced together ancient marginalia and practical desperation into a sentence that halted both breath and action. "There is a ritual that can sever this tether. It will bind their souls, his and the giver's, such that the night-born heart may beat with warmth. There is a cost." Mara's first response was incredulous. "What kind of cost?" "To bind the night-born heart to a sun-born blood requires a free offering," Brother Havel said. "The blood must be given willingly and under a true moon. It will intermingle with the night-born's essence, may temper, may end. It can be a cure or a conflagration. The margins of the text are not kind." She swallowed back the sharpness of fear and found, beneath it, a bright and dangerous clarity. All her life she had been told what she did not fit into, measured out and boxed. Here was a possibility that asked for the only thing that had ever mattered to her: the choice. To live in the same old smallness and let the nobles recalibrate their cruelty, or to step into a moment that might correct something far older than the ledger's ink. Standing in the hall with Lucien, whose breaths came like fragments of old music, she realized that the court's rebellion was less about her than a defense of a way of life that took without asking. To refuse the ritual would mean a slow concession to an order that would preserve itself by erasing any threat. To accept might mean death, or it might mean a rebirth. If she gave her blood willingly and under the moon, she could bind him to the cadence of a heartbeat that might teach him humility, restraint, and perhaps, in some luminous and terrifying way, the capacity for life. She told him she would do it. The words left her mouth like a stone thrown into a dark well. Lucien's face emptied of expression and then filled with something that tore at the careful, cultivated pallor of his manners. He tried to refuse her, to call the plan madness. He tried to bargain with vows and with plans for exile and shelter. But Mara did not waver. She had grown in kitchens where decisions were made with the economy of immediate need. She had been small in a world that told her what she could be. Here, in the rubble of the court's rebellion, she seized the hardest thing she knew: choice. They prepared for the ritual with a clumsiness born of desperation. The night was chosen. The true moon, when the sky would be honest and bare. Brother Havel drew his lines in chalk on the castle's old stone, calling on margins of scripture and ancient counsel. Isolde and a handful of loyal ones, those who believed that change could be less terrible than stagnation, stood vigil with lanterns low, a witness and a barrier against the court's further violence. Myra stood at the center of the marked circle. The moon spilled over the parapet and fell on her like a benediction. She felt its cold, and then the simple, domestic thing she loved most, her own pulse knocking against her ribs. Lucien stood across from her. He had not come in armor, but in a simple dark coat that made his pale hands look like slabs of bone. He looked at her with an intensity that made the edges of the world blur. Brother Havel chanted in a tongue that had the rhythm of old prayer and the economy of law. The ritual's words hung like small flags in the night, and every syllable seemed to make the air thicker. Myra knelt. She wrapped her fingers around a cup of iron and set it on the stone between them. She could have withdrawn, could have let the current take her into an exile of anonymity, could have kept her life in the measured safety of the heated kitchen. But she had seen how softly Lucien's face could alter when she did simple things like tie a knot or pour broth. She had seen in him the brittle outline of a man who had practiced not feeling, and who might be small mercy's last hope. When she offered her arm, she did so with eyes bright and steady. "Do it with respect," she said. "Do it as a promise." He knelt opposite, and there was no grand flourish. The moment between them was quiet, unadorned by the theatrics of court. His fingers brushed hers as if to anchor himself, and for a moment they shared the animal equality of two people whose hands understood the language of sustenance. When he drank, it was with a reverence that seemed to have been manufactured from centuries of need. His jaw worked, the muscles at his throat tightened. Then it happened. A sound not unlike a struck bell reverberated through his chest, subtle and miraculous. His heart, which had not been heard for ages, answered with a tentative, astonished beat. The first beat was not triumphant so much as stunned. Lucien's shoulders sagged as if a weight dropped from them, and then one heavier replaced it. The responsibility of being mortal in the same way as all who could age and fall. He looked up at Mara, eyes wet with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Live," he begged, voice raspy. "Please, live." Mara closed her eyes against the sudden rush of warmth that spread along her skin, sunlight tasting of iron and truth. She felt the world tilt, felt warmth course into parts of her she had never known would receive it. She whispered against his coat, breath warm on his collar. "Now you know what warmth feels like," she said, and those words felt like the closing of a covenant. Then there was an avalanche of sensation. The exchange that had been performed in quiet and reverence took on a feral edge. The court, sensing the shift in the king, lashed out in a final surge of desperate violence. Men with knives gleamed against moonlight, and the castle, already a body of old pain, shook as if convulsed. The ritual, being an act of binding, can be messy in the way births are messy. It was intimate and violent, sacred and physical. Lucien's heartbeat steadied, then grew, and in the small, pregnant pause that separated fear from triumph, Mara felt a lightness bleeding away from her limbs. She tried to hold it, to be the anchor in the storm she had chosen, but the ritual had demanded an honesty more complete than any bargain had ever asked. She collapsed into his arms as the courtyard erupted into a melee of light and blood. He caught her as if he had been waiting centuries for this small, warm thing to be placed in his hands and learned, all at once, how to cradle life gently. He held her to him with a tenderness that contradicted the savage display around them, kissing her forehead with an urgency that was apology and thanksgiving all at once. "Stay," he murmured. "You cannot leave." She smiled, faint and luminous with the sort of peace that follows a hard decision. Rain, old-world rain that had been held at bay all night by the moon's glare, began to fall in a hush over the tumult. She closed her eyes and let the warmth gather like a small bloom in the center of her chest. "You already have something to remember," she breathed. Her breath slowed. The light in her veins flashed like a candle guttering in a sudden wind. They carried her into the heart of the castle as it fell about them, the rebels' doom conspiring with Lucien's court's last stand. The air smelled of iron and smoke, of wax and the peaceful rot of velvet. Isolde helped bear her weight with a dignity that had no grandiosity, only an honest strength. The castle trembled as ruptured loyalties and old bargains disintegrated. Fires began in the kitchens from overturned lamps. The old tapestries caught and then took a long, greedy glow. Stone heated and cracked, letting loose sighs of dust. Those who could flee did, slipping into the black river's folds or hiding in the hollows where the bats found shelter. Others, men who had been too invested in what the night had given them, sought to take what they could before the clock ran out. The sky turned, slowly at first and then in a rush as dawn. An impossible, unheard-of dawn, bent its first bright finger toward the castle after 4 centuries of muted days. They laid Mara on a cloth in the moonlit hall while the world tilted toward sunlight. Her skin, which had always had a healthy warmth, now carried a new luminescence, subtle, as if a faint sunrise had been captured in her veins. Lucien knelt by her side with hands that trembled not from urgency, but from the strain of all the choices he had made. "You are my dawn," he said, the sentence ridiculous and wholly true at once. He pressed his lips to her forehead and then to the hollow beneath her ear. Her eyelids fluttered and then stilled. For a breath, for an impossible heartbeat, it seemed as if the ritual's magic had birthed a new, fragile equilibrium. The castle's fires dimmed as if exhausted. Those who remained looked at each other with a dawning bewilderment, unlike the old conspiratorial certainty. They had chosen violence, and the violence they had sought to perpetuate had been turned back into a different currency, the price of a life. When the horizon finally bled into the faintest wash of color, first a ribbon of pale rose, then the honest gold of morning, Mara's chest gave a single, quiet exhalation that felt like release. Around her, those who had believed in her generosity, or feared what it might mean, watched with faces uncomprehending. Lucien held her as if wanting to stop the world from moving on, as if his arms could secure permanence. The first sunbeam reached across the hall like an accuser and a benediction at once. Her breath slowed and then ceased, in a silence that had the weight of a closing book. The world seemed to pause, balancing on a single, fragile point. For a moment, something like peace hovered, as if the choice she had offered had been enough to settle more than a single heart. Lucien's hands shook as he cradled the stillness that had once been the woman who had taught him warmth. Then, as the sun climbed higher, and the castle realized the true meaning of morning, a sound like a whisper grew into something like the rustle of leaves. Mara's chest lifted imperceptibly, and for those who were trained to read death by its finality, it was not yet darkness. Her fingers twitched. A faint color rose again to her cheeks and then bled like the first cautious promise of spring. She opened her eyes, and the room saw the pale gold of someone who had traveled near the border of living and come back changed. Lucien bent and kissed her forehead in a vow of ownership that had shed possessiveness for adoration. "You are my dawn," he said again, and this time his voice held the sound of a man who had been taught how to be mortal and intended, finally, to learn kindness. Around them, the remnants of rebellion cooled into a wary new order. The castle's ravages would take time to mend, but there was, beneath the ruin, an ember of something new. Mara smiled once, a movement so small it was almost private. Sunlight, fragile and bright, picked out the faint veins under her skin as if someone had sewn gold thread into the fabric of her blood. "Go on," she whispered with a strength that surprised even her. "Live with the thing you have learned." He would live. He would learn. He would walk among the ruins with the memory of her offering etched into the pace of his heart. For the moment, though, the world held its breath at the edge of a new day, and in that pause the impossible truth sat. She had given her warmth, and in doing so altered the compass of a court and a king. Whether she would remain was a delicate thing, balanced between the tenderness of recovery and the brutality of consequence. The sun rose, and the castle, for the first time in ages, felt its light. The work of mending a kingdom is quieter than the work of tearing it down. Where flames had licked tapestries and smoke had blackened carved faces, hands now moved with deliberate gentleness. Laborers hauled sodden cloths and rewove flags. Masons set new mortar where old grief had cracked stone. The kitchens, which had once been stages for small betrayals, filled again with the honest heat of bread rising. Isolde walked those halls with a pace that had lost none of its precision, but softened around the edges. She brokered deals with a steadier hand, and sometimes paused at doorways to listen to a laughter that had not been allowed before. Brother Havel taught apprentices to copy marginalia with the reverence of someone preserving small miracles. His notes no longer trembled with panic, but with the careful hope of someone cataloging a new beginning. Lucien moved through the castle as a man who had learned the meaning of weight. The pulse beneath his ribs was no longer the cold metronome of a bargain, but a rhythm that pulled at him with the demands of weather and of mercy. He rose with dawn and found himself watching the light as if it were something he was still learning to name. The moon, once the honest ruler of his nights, now shared the sky with a sun that returned obligations, new chores and new vulnerabilities. He walked the corridors that had once been his private gallery of mourning and found they answered differently now. Portraits no longer sat with eyes that asked for tribute, but with faces that seemed, in the hush between things, to allow forgiveness. He returned, more often than not, to the garden. The beds that had once drooped with the resignation of old roses had been tended until their thorns shone like armor polished for the sake of beauty rather than war. Where petals had browned and curled, they now unfurled in tentative pinks and fierce crimsons, as if the earth itself exhaled in relief. The fountain at the garden's heart had been cleaned of its winter crust, its stone rubbed until it reflected without the distortion of soot. When he leaned over the water and watched the surface, the reflection blurred by a ripple, he sometimes thought he saw her, not as a ghost that hovered with the cliché of loss, but as an essence that had been threaded into the air itself. A smile would touch the curve of lips she had once pressed to his brow. It would be quick as a fish's flick and vanish like a blessing left for him alone. People spoke of the nights in which light returned as if it had been a miracle, but miracles, those who lived by utility knew, are hours of work disguised as wonders. The common folk, whose days are stitched by necessity rather than by legend, spoke in simpler terms. They said a woman had given the thing she would not bargain, and in so doing changed the order of things. Market sellers recut their wares. Tradesmen found customers who once fled the night. Children who had never seen dawn in their parents' stories learned to squint at the sun like an animal newly domesticated. Songs formed in taverns that carried the strange, dizzy lyric of one who had glimpsed hope and would not let it go. Rumor, that old, energetic thing, took to the road like a favored horse. At first there were whispers, half-formed, shy, of a queen who had stepped out of a ledger and into legend. Ballads named her in the same breath as reckoning. The mail-order bride turned dawn-bearer, the woman whose blood tamed a king. Some accounts, told where candles made truth soft, spoke of Mara rising again from the linen as if sleep could be unmade by love. Others insisted she had simply been spared by fresh mercy and lived, laughing, in a wing of the keep that the court had designated for sunlight and honest warmth. No single account could hold the whole truth. That truth, like so many luminous things, resisted being bound. Lucien did not demand that the story be simple. He knew the contortions of narratives, how people like their suffering neat and their deliverance tidy. He learned, slowly, that a life lived under a beating heart makes for a person who must answer questions. He spent mornings teaching the baker's son to recognize certain cuts of meat and evenings learning the shapes of trust from a servant's honest, blunt counsel. He sought out the small reparations he had ignored when power made his will feel inevitable. In private, when the weight of his newness sank heavy, he would go to the fountain and let the world tell him what it already knew, that a man who had learned to be forgiven could now begin to learn how to forgive himself. Isolde kept her counsel and her loyalty. She visited the villages in disguise and brought back stories of little mercies, of a widow whose rent had been forgiven, of apprentices who were taken into employ not for what they could profit, but for the steadiness of their hands. Brother Havel, who had expected the scriptures to be a chain, found instead that some texts offered room for interpretation, space where compassion could be argued as doctrine rather than anomaly. Together they rewove the kingdom's council into something less brittle. The nobles who remained were taught, with varying difficulty, that dominion without duty was a poor scaffold on which to build a future. As the weeks turned, visitors came bearing gifts of strange, small things. A potter with clay the color of river mud, a weaver who had never seen roses bloom in that particular shade, a child with a voice that repeated the new songs like a ceremony. They came not merely to see the man who had once been a king of night, but to see the place where a choice had been made, and to feel, perhaps, whether they too could be asked for a price and be brave enough to pay it. Lucien watched them with an interest that was less courtly curiosity and more like one who studies the faces of people keeping small honors. One evening, when the air wore the thick velvet of late summer and the roses threw their scent like a promise into the garden, Lucien stood alone by the fountain. The surface of the water caught the last of the light and folded it into a dozen tiny stars. He saw, for a breath, the almost impossible clarity of her face reflected there, not pale as a ghost, not diminished by absence, but luminous as if she had been carved out of dawn itself. He put his hand on the stubborn stone rim and felt, beneath his palm, the slow memory of warmth that was more human than legend. He spoke then, though to whom he did not know, not to the water, not to the garden, and perhaps not even to the part of himself that had been altered. "You were more than they could measure," he said, his voice thin with the tenderness of an apology to bones. The words were not meant for any courtly ear. They were a confession to the place where she had once stood and the feeling she had left behind. A servant approached with a small, wrapped parcel and a note from the village baker. Bread thick and still warm. Lucien accepted it like a benediction. He turned the parcel in his hands and found himself smiling, not with the brittle politeness of an audience, but with the odd, private contentment of someone who has been taught to live with gratitude. He set the bread upon the fountain's rim and let the scent rise, yeast like memory, salt like the taste of returning home. There were days when the grief returned, small and unbidden, when a door slammed too loudly, or when a portrait's eyes held a look that was less forgiving than trust. Those were the days he would walk the parapets and let his heart move with the rhythm of the wind, learning that even a beating heart could be steady without being tyrannical. He learned to ask, to listen, to pause. The kingdom learned, too. It was not perfect. Nothing such has ever been. There were agreements yet to be made and consequences to atone for. But in the slow, patient work of rebuilding, mortar laid in kindness, law written with the ink of mercy, something else grew. A tentative conviction that a life given freely could rewrite the ledger of a realm. And in the quiet, when shadows pooled like dark water and the world seemed to inhale before exhaling, the fountain would sometimes answer him with a ripple and a flash of a smile. He never knew, in the way certainty names things, whether it was memory reflected back or the soft persistence of her essence threaded into the very air. Either way, it was enough to keep the heart learning its new measures. They said she was too much for this world. They were right, she was enough to awaken it.